The war in Korea has already almost destroyed that nation of 20 million people. I've never seen such devastation. I've seen, I guess, as much blood and disaster as any living man, and it just curdled my stomach the last time I was there. After I looked at the wreckage and those thousands of women and children and everything, I vomited. I shrink with a horror that I cannot express in words at this continuous slaughter. That was a quote by World War II veteran General Douglas MacArthur, recorded during a 1951 US military hearing on the military situation in the Far East. We wanted to begin with that so you know what you're getting into. If you don't want the atrocities committed in the Korean War to stay in your soul forever, turn back now. For everyone else, in the early days of the Korean War, namely the summer of 1950, the South Korean government committed heinous acts against South Koreans whom they deemed communists or communist sympathizers. One of the largest atrocities to take place during this time was the Bodo League massacre, something the government tried to keep under wraps for decades after the war. Before the war, the South Korean government created what was known as the National Bodo League, a movement with the aim of, in quotation marks, re-educating communists or pretty much anyone else the government didn't like. After the Korean People's Army, or KPA, attacked on the 25th of June, South Korean President Nogeun-ri answered by ordering his retreating forces to execute people he'd detained under the National Bodo League movement without trial. One massacre which fell under the umbrella of the Bodo League massacre occurred in a place called Daejeon, also known as Taejeon. Here, between the 28th of June and the 16th of July, the Korean National Police executed between 4,000 and 7,000 suspected communist sympathizers. US forces just stood by and watched and took photos which weren't brought to light until 1999, some 50 years after the end of the war. In the words of American historian Bruce Cummings, as the KPA bore upon the city of Taejeon, South Korean authorities removed political prisoners from local jails, men and boys along with some women, massacred them, threw them into open pits, and dumped the earth back on them. All in all, somewhere between 60,000 and 200,000 people were massacred by the South Korean government that summer. And if you were wondering, things didn't get any better from there. On the 26th of July 1950, as it was later brought to light in an Associated Press story in 1999, the US 7th Cavalry Regiment became embroiled in an atrocity in North Korea. Here, some 600 North Korean refugees trying to flee the war stumbled into a US roadblock near the village of Nogeun-ri. The soldiers searched the refugees, confiscating knives and anything else that could be used as a weapon, and then American planes started strafing the refugees while they were resting, gunning down men, women, and children alike. The survivors fled to the relative safety of a nearby bridge underpass, only for the 7th Cavalry Regiment to follow them. According to one Chun Chun-ja, who was just a girl at the time, the American soldiers played with our lives like boys playing with flies. A Korean named Park Sun-young reported similar depravity. Children were screaming in fear and adults were praying for their lives, and the whole time, the Americans never stopped shooting. Between 160 and 400 North Koreans fell to American bullets in the Nogeun-ri area between that day and the 29th. Two of Park Sun-young's children were among the dead. US Army documents, later exhumed by journalists and scholars, suggested that American forces in Korea adopted a policy of firing on approaching refugee groups, at least in part because the refugees might have been North Korean soldiers in disguise. One of such documents was a July 1950 memo by the US Air Force Operations Chief in Korea, one Colonel Turner C. Rogers. It read as follows: "It is reported that large groups of civilians, either composed of or controlled by North Korean soldiers, are infiltrating US positions. The army has requested that we strafe all civilian refugee parties that are noted approaching our positions. To date, we have complied with the army request in this respect. The following quote by US soldier Edward L. Daly further evinces the American policy. Command looked at it as getting rid of the problem in the easiest way. That was to shoot them in a group. We ended up shooting until all the bodies we saw were lifeless. On summer nights when the breeze is blowing, I can still hear their cries, the little kids screaming. While what truly motivated the soldiers to commit the Nogeun-ri massacre might remain a topic of debate, it was an atrocity, no less. One which 7th Cavalry Regiment veteran Norman Tinkler summarized well. We just annihilated them. It was like an Indian raid from back in the old days. But wait, it gets worse. According to North Korea, and as displayed at North Korea's Sinchon Museum of American War Atrocities, South Korean and American troops butchered as many as 35,000 North Korean civilians in Sinchon throughout October and December 1950. This affair is absolutely steeped in controversy, however, and who actually perpetrated the war crimes remains unclear. According to Chicago Tribune journalist Uli Schmitzer, if any truth about massacres in Sinchon ever existed, the evidence has long ago been obscured. The town has been turned into a national shrine by a ruthless propaganda machine that has fueled anti-American passions. If we believe what North Korea says, what went down in Sinchon over those 52 days was truly not human. In 1998, the Korean Central News Agency described the Sinchon massacre as such. The Yankees separated the mothers from their children before pouring gasoline on the children and babies who were crying for milk. They threw flaming torches to kill them. They drowned over 2,000 innocent people by dropping them from Soktung Bridge. They also drowned more than 1,000 women in Sowon Reservoir. Upwards of 1,200 people detained in an ice warehouse were bitten to death by military dogs. The enemies disemboweled a pregnant woman to hold up the 9-month embryo on the end of a bayonet while laughing aloud. Propaganda or not, the report went on in that manner. The aforementioned historian Bruce Cummings expressed his opinion on the massacre in his book, War and Television, published in 1992. If any Americans were present, they were probably Korean Military Advisory Group personnel who witnessed many South Korean atrocities against civilians. The Koreans I spoke with were adamant that Americans had carried out the massacres, but it's also true that Koreans do not like to admit that Koreans could do such things unless they are following American orders. Things back in South Korea were looking pretty grim at the time of the Sinchon massacre too. From December 1950 to April 1951, the South Korean government drafted some 406,000 citizens into what was called the National Defense Corps, organizing them into 49 units for training purposes. With the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, or PVA, advancing, the South Korean government ordered the National Defense Corps to withdraw south. This quickly turned into a death march, as their commander, the not-so-wonderful Kim Yong-gyeon, had embezzled all the funds he was supposed to spend on food and supplies for these 400,000 men. Marching 480 Ks or 300 miles over a 3-week period, as many as 300,000 National Defense Corps personnel either starved to death, succumbed to disease, or deserted. That was if they hadn't already perished in the so-called training camps. In April, the National Assembly began investigating the case and disbanding the National Defense Corps. Commander Yong-gyeon and his fellow embezzlers had stolen around 5 billion won and donated tens of millions of won to the president. In August, Yong-gyeon and his 4 accomplices were executed by firing squad, but the damage had been done, the lives wasted. As some reports suggest, joint US United Nations POW camps weren't exactly paradise for captured North Koreans. According to KPA soldier Kim Song-tae, our life was nothing but misery and torture from the first days of our capture. We were beaten, starved, tortured. We were treated worse than beasts. In May 1952, in a UN camp known as the Georgi POW camp, word spread that Chinese prisoners detained there would ultimately not be repatriated to China. So they revolted, taking the camp commandant, American Brigadier General Francis Dodd, hostage. To quell the revolt, the British and Canadian guards employed tear gas, flamethrowers, and Patton tanks. According to Canadian soldier Tom Mackay, American General Hayden Bull Boatner told the guards to bayonet the prisoners and shoot to kill. "If you see somebody escaping, you're going to shoot," said Bull. "Then make goddamn sure you kill him because the hospital's full right now." In this one revolt, 40 prisoners were killed, and the UN guards decapitated 4 POWs and hung their heads from trees as a warning. Brigadier General Dodd was ultimately released. As brought to light in the trial of American Private Isaac Davis, sexual abuse was present in at least some of the American POW camps as well. Davis, specifically, had prisoners perform oral sex on him, and he sodomized them. To some guards, the POWs were, quotes, playthings and slaves. Of course, those were just a few of the atrocities perpetrated by South Koreans and Americans, as well as some non-American UN troops during the war, and we haven't even touched on North Korean atrocities, of which there were plenty, so let's do that. One of the KPA's earliest atrocities occurred in the South Korean capital, Seoul, on the 28th of June 1950. Here, in the wake of the First Battle of Seoul, KPA troops massacred between 700 and 900 doctors, nurses, and inpatient civilians at Seoul National University, as well as 100 wounded South Korean soldiers who were being treated there. The KPA either shot their victims or buried them alive, and things didn't get any brighter from that point forward. A number of North Korean war crimes were unveiled in December 1953 before the United States Subcommittee on Korean War Atrocities. This hearing was compiled in a 3-part document titled simply Korean War Atrocities. In Part 2, American Captain Linton Butray, an administrative officer with the Medical Corps, described what happened when KPA troops attacked a makeshift medical camp he had established with a non-combatant Christian chaplain and between 15 and 20 wounded men near Kumcheon, South Korea in July 1950. "We looked across the hills and saw a wave of enemy coming. The chaplain was administering spiritual rites to the patients. The KPA just flooded us and shot the patients on the litters." The KPA also shot Butray, wounding him as well as the chaplain, who died. This was despite the fact that both Butray and the chaplain wore Red Cross brassards. The captain was the only survivor of this massacre, and he only survived by playing dead. That same month, US Corporal Charles Kinnard was captured by a patrol of KPA soldiers who saw fit to torture him for seemingly no reason other than for their own sick pleasure. Kinnard described the affair as such. "First, they put rocks in my shoes and they would chase me around until I would fall. I lost quite a bit of blood, and when I would come to, they would press cigarettes into my bare feet and legs and various places." Kinnard's captors also tortured him by pushing a can opener into the open wound in his back and then twisting it. Another atrocity mentioned at the hearing, and one of the most infamous from the Korean War, was the Hill 303 massacre of August 1950. Here, during the Battle of Daegu, elements of a US battalion were surrounded by KPA troops while they were trying to cross the Naktong River near Hill 303 in South Korea. Outnumbered, the battalion surrendered, and the KPA took as many as 46 men captive. Taking the Americans to a nearby orchard, they removed their shoes and some of their clothes, tied their wrists behind their backs with shoestrings, and told them they would be transferred to a POW camp. When any of the POWs resisted, the soldiers beat them to death. The following day, however, UN air forces attacked the hill, paving the way for a contingent of US soldiers. Unable to hold the prisoners and fend off the advancing Americans, the KPA troops had the prisoners kneel in a gully where they mowed them down with submachine guns. 4 men survived by hiding under the corpses of their brothers in arms. One of the survivors was Corporal Roy Manring, who described what it was like in that blood-soaked gully before he got shot. "They'd come by and they started kicking, and you could hear the fellows hollering, grunting, groaning, and praying. And when they kicked me, they kicked my leg, and I made a grunting sound, and that's when I caught it in the gut." In August of that same year, another massacre went down in the Masan area of South Korea. Surrounded by a regiment of the KPA near the village of Pongamni, around 100 troops from 2 US field artillery battalions were killed in battle, leaving just 75 men alive. The KPA rounded these survivors up, ushering 50 of them into a house and then mowing them down and executing the remaining 20 with shots to the head. This was known as the Bloody Gulch Massacre, and in the wake of this atrocity and Hill 303, General MacArthur issued the following warning to North Korea's military leaders. "I shall hold you and your commanders criminally accountable under the rules and precedents of war." Of course, MacArthur's warning did nothing to stop the atrocities. In October 1950, some 180 American POWs were placed on a train to be transported deep into North Korea. On the 5-day journey, they were exposed to the cold and weren't given any food or medical attention. Many died on the way. To avoid air raids, the train halted at Suncheon Tunnel on the 30th of October, and it was during this stopover that KPA troops marched some of the POWs to a nearby ravine, where they cut 68 of them down with SMGs. American Private John Martin described it like this: "We went around the corner into this ditch. The soldiers said, 'Get down, the planes, get down, the planes.' So when we all ducked down some more, soldiers came up on us over a little rice paddy and they just opened up." Like Mannering, Martin survived by hiding among the bodies of his brothers in arms. Of the 180 Americans who had boarded that train, only 21 survived. December 1950 saw another infamous atrocity. Much to their horror, the men of a South Korean patrol happened upon the corpses of 5 US American airmen tortured to death by enemy troops after their truck convoy was ambushed in North Korea. The KPA soldiers had tortured the airmen by sharpening bamboo sticks and slowly pressing them again and again into their flesh. At the US Subcommittee on Korean War Atrocities hearing, American Lieutenant Colonel James Rogers, who had served in the medical section of the US 1st Army Corps in Korea, described what he saw when he examined the dead airmen. They suffered multiple superficial and deep spear wounds over the body, the face, the chest, and the abdomen. By the nature of the wounds, I'm of the opinion that the instrument of torture had been previously heated. After torturing them with the superficial wounds, they bayoneted them with the same instruments, and these fellows were allowed to bleed to death. Though, even if captured US soldiers survived long enough to enter enemy POW camps, that didn't mean they were out of the woods. American Lieutenant Colonel Abbott was a POW for 33 months during the war. He later described the conditions of a Chinese-run camp where they experimented on inmates by cutting them open and putting, in quotation marks, monkey glands, which were actually chicken livers, inside of them. In this hospital, men were dying again daily. They were sleeping on the floor and they were covered with maggots. They were suffering from dysentery, pellagra, beriberi, and so on. The Chinese had introduced an operation that they claimed was a cure-all for all diseases. They referred to it as a tissue operation, in which they made an incision under the arm and injected into this incision a chicken liver. It was then re-sewed and allowed to heal. The horrors go on, far further and deeper than we have time or stomach for today. As evinced in the sources we referred to in this video, it seems that both the North and South Koreans, along with their Chinese and American allies, were neck deep in war crimes and atrocities. There were no good guys, and MacArthur was right to vomit and shrink whenever he envisioned the slaughter that was the war in Korea. But did you know that the Korean War was so brutal? Do you have anything to add to the atrocities we covered? Can you think of any more? Sinchon was one of the most controversial atrocities we covered today. What do you think happened there? And lastly, which nation do you think perpetrated the worst atrocities of the war? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.